Okay, you're live.
Great. Welcome everyone to Senate Education, Wednesday afternoon, January 10th, 1:30. Ms. Richter, do you mind joining us at the table?
Happy to.
Julia Richter is your title fiscal analyst?
It's senior fiscal
Senior,
analyst.
that's not, yeah, no, I knew it was gonna be something. I get it. We wanna be accurate with the joint fiscal office.
Yes.
And we're really happy that you're here to talk to us. Some of it will be a review, some new information. What the committee is interested in, if I could just sort of tee it up for a minute, not only with your testimony, but later we're going to hear from Beth St. James, and I think a little bit from you again at the end of the day, on trying to understand what's happening out there on the education front, particularly around the education fund, taxes. People have heard a lot over the past several months about increase in taxes. So we thought I should also mention we've heard quite a bit about the possible impact of the weighting, which was Act 127, which this body passed 2 years ago. And so we thought we'd kick it off with you. We're going back, talking a little bit about the education fund, helping us understand it, what's in it, all that sort of thing. So with that, unless I'm missing something, committee, okay. And we have with us Finn is from Orca, and he is going, so folks know, be videotaping us as well. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. For the record, Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Nice to see you all. I think this is my first time in your committee this year, so great to be back. There are a few documents that I have prepared for today's testimony. I was a little late getting them to Morgan. So I don't know, would you like me to share my screen? Do folks want to pull it up in front of them? How would you like to do it?
Both would be great. You would share your screen, and if anybody wants to pull it.
And could I have a Zoom link, please?
I'll send it to you right now.
On the website. You did say you just got them to Morgan a little while ago?
I did, yes.
Okay. Morgan, do you have those documents?
They should be up on the committee page.
So
In the Tuesday folder.
In the Tuesday folders, or today's Wednesday, so Wednesday folders.
Yes.
are you seeing those?
We don't see them. But I think we should get started.
Sure, I'm happy to pull it up on my screen,
We'd like you to put it up on your screen for sure.
and I'm just joining the Zoom link now. Thank you. And while we're working through all of these technical as we're working through the technical things that we're dealing with at the moment, just a little bit of background in terms of level setting. There is a presentation, sort of Education Fund 101, to sort of review and level set, Education Fund, how it works, how pupil weights fit into the Ed Fund, what comes into the Ed Fund, what goes out of the Ed Fund. There's probably a bit more information in the slides than we may get to today than may be relevant for the committee. So there's a lot in there, and it really is hopefully a resource to help move forward. So we'll do a little bit of level setting with Education Finance 101, and then moving forward to the December 1st letter and the corresponding estimated forecasted property tax bill increases, what those mean, what they don't mean, what has gone into those estimates. All right.
You should be able to.
Perfect, thank you.
And we did ask Morgan to Morgan, just send us let Megan know when these documents are in her folders.
Yeah, we're
Absolutely.
Great. So, is that a good size for folks? All right. So this is a presentation I've given, I think, to this committee before, as well as to other committees and your colleagues' House side. And so essentially what we're going to do, big picture overview, Ed Fund and Ed Finance. How does it work? We're going to dive a little bit into education expenditures out of the Education Fund, and then dive a little bit deeper and talk about education funding, the property taxes, the non-property tax revenue sources, and pupil weights. And before diving in any deeper, I do want to just say that we're talking about state education funding, so I'm not bringing in federal funds into this conversation. We're just talking about state dollars. So, big picture overview. Vermont's education funding system is different than other states. It's unique. That's because it's a statewide funding formula that's coupled with local property tax administration. Essentially, what that means is that school district spending is determined at the local level. School boards set budgets that must be approved by voters. And then the legislature, the General Assembly, sets education yields, we'll talk about what that means, and tax rates, property tax rates, annually at the level necessary to fund education expenditures. And this is different from other funds that we talk about in the state because, you know, the general fund, we say, okay, we've got this much money, this is how it's getting parsed out, right? But education fund, it's, okay, what are all of the things that we need to pay out of the education fund? And then how are we gonna make sure that there's sufficient revenue to pay out all of those expenditures? Two types of property taxes, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. There's a homestead property tax, a non-homestead property tax. And then finally, since the Brigham decision, which was a Supreme Court case, now the homestead property tax rate is is a function of district per pupil spending decisions. So this is different where it's not a function of property wealth. So regardless of a district's property wealth, its homestead rates are going to depend on its per pupil spending and not on how much can be raised on its grant list.
Yes, and do it.
Is it okay if we ask questions as we
Oh,
go?
Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
yes.
Unpack for us a little bit how the legislature sets the education yields and the property tax rates, because I think for a lot of folks that's kind of shrouded in mystery.
Definitely. I'll say it's an annual process, starts traditionally in Ways and Means, and then moves through the building accordingly to make sure that there are sufficient revenues raised. And thinking about the calculation of that and where those numbers come from, I think may be helpful to dive into a little bit later when talking about the setting of tax rates, if that's okay.
Sure.
To sort of level set, how do we know how much money needs to be raised? What does that look like?
So while we're also on the Brigham decision, so would you help the committee understand how, when you say Vermont's property tax or education funding is different, if you go over the border, New York, Massachusetts, what's happening there that, or in other states that's not happening or happening in a different way?
Education is funded by some combination of both state revenue or state funds as well as funds that have been raised at the local level to help fund school districts. So Vermont is all state education funded, whereas other states have this town component and a state component. Vermont also has local decisions in terms of its school budgets. So in other states, often when referring to pupil weighting, for instance, it's okay, this pupil weight corresponds with X number of dollars extra that school district receives for having students in certain categories that may or may not be less costly to educate. Vermont does not use pupil weights in the same way. Here they're used more to adjust tax rates and tax capacity. So the state is not saying, here's X number of dollars because you have X number of students in grade 5. Instead, they're saying, okay, we're going to adjust your ability to draw funds from the education fund for a certain tax rate. There are also funds that come out of the education fund that are determined at the state level that are written into statute. So certain special education dollars, transportation aid, universal school meals, those are some examples.
So does it matter, and this might be helpful for everyone to hear, does it matter where you live in the state? Does it make a difference how much your school might end up getting? Does that play a role in any way?
So
Historically in other states where you live, generally your school is going to historically, I think, get more. Does that make a difference in Vermont?
does not make a difference in the sense of if you live in this community, this school district is going to receive X number of dollars because it's this community. It makes a difference in terms of the makeup of the student population in a district
Yep.
and how the property tax rates are calculated through pupil weighting. Sure. So yes, please interrupt me with questions as I go along. This is a lot to unpack and I'll say high level.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you a stupid question today. So homestead versus non-homestead, which one's in state, out of state, second home? I just have not really dealt with the concept.
Sure. So, yeah, maybe I'll just move forward and we can I'll talk about this in a second. Homestead, non-homestead. So homestead is essentially someone's principal primary dwelling and all of the corresponding land acreage that goes with that dwelling. Homestead taxes are where the income sensitivity portion falls in the property tax credit. Non-homestead is everything else that's subject to property tax that's not a homestead. So that includes apartments, apartment buildings, it includes businesses and commercial properties, it includes second homes. So that's a uniform tax rate across the state for anything that's not a homestead. Uniform before the CLA has been applied.
Can you just, at 10,000 feet, give a sense of the relationship between the two? Like one is 75% of the other, or?
Yes. So this is, I haven't had a chance to update this chart. I've been a little busy with lots of folks trying to understand the Ed Fund. But this is the Ed Fund sources in 2022, just to have a sense of what we're looking at. So the green boxes, those are your property taxes. So the dark green far left, you'll see that non-homestead is about 40%. And then the lighter green is the net homestead education property tax. It's net because it's including the property tax credit, the income sensitivity portion.
Okay, this is good, but my question really is, a second home versus a primary home, how are they taxed?
So primary home would be subject to the homestead property tax rate for the school district that it's in, and a second home would be subject to the non-homestead property tax.
So is there like at a high level, how do they compare? Second home, non-homestead tax rate is
Oh,
50% of homestead.
I see what you're asking. So you're asking about the relationship in the tax rates.
Correct.
So that's a policy decision, and that varies by year. We will talk about, it's
You
posted
can
under
use
my.
any example. You know,
So, okay,
this
so.
year, last year, 10, just get a sense.
Okay, so I will preface this with, hold on, I'm having a little bit of. Give me a second. Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the December 1st Ed Fund Outlook. I think that before we dive into it in great detail, it'd be helpful to have a little bit more context. But the homestead property tax rate does vary by school district based on spending decisions. So the average is just that, it's an average. That being said, and this is equalized level, so the uniform non-homestead property tax rate in FY24, 1.391, and for homestead, 1.311.
Okay, that helps. Very close.
Sure. It's really a policy. I'm not trying to be opaque. It's really a policy decision, and it depends on the year. So it's up to the General Assembly every year how the tax rates are calculated. And it's the policy decision really is when I'm doing the modeling and looking at, okay, what are we gonna, for setting the property tax rates, how are we going to do that? The question is, usually comes back to what is the average bill change going to be in the different classes? So what would be the average bill change for a non-homestead property tax payer, and what would be the average bill change for a homestead property tax payer? And that is a policy decision. So for instance, last year I was asked to solve for the yield and the non-homestead rate so that the average bill change would be uniform for both property classes. So because we're thinking about a tax bill as having two components, the rate, the property value, a direct comparison of rates is not always going to tell the whole picture, right? Because certain properties may be growing more or less, depending on the community that they're in. So we talk about the average bill change. Does that get at what you're asking? Okay. So going into education expenditures that are paid out of the education fund, and this is, I think, a helpful place to really ground the conversation in terms of starting, because you'll recall that the ed fund is different, where the total amount that needs to be raised by property taxes directly corresponds to how much needs to be paid out of the ed fund. So starting at the local level, we'll talk about the local level and then the state level, because local school districts are building budgets that are then put forth to the local voters. Each year, a school district builds an annual budget. It requires local voter approval. And in general, and this is a high level presentation, in general, we can kind of think about these school budgets as having two parts, sort of two buckets. One is the offsetting revenues. And this includes things like state categorical aid. So how much is the state saying you get, based on what is written in the green books, you get X number of dollars for special education or universal school meals. It also includes tuition revenues that are paid to that school district. So other schools are sending kids and the school district needs to educate those students. Prior year surpluses or deficits, reserve funds. So those are the offsetting revenues. And then the remainder, which is everything that the school district has built into its budget that are not offsetting revenues, that's referred to as education spending. And that's one of, when we talk about homestead property tax rates and how they vary by district, this is one of those big components that we're going to keep coming back to, is that education spending number. So school budget minus the offsetting revenues. And so then the state level, we've talked about this, statewide aggregated costs of public education includes all school budgets. That is not the federal categorical aid. And we can again think about two buckets. Here we can think about the education payment, and that's just summed up all the education spending across the state, so across all school districts. And then there's everything else. So there's the categorical aid, there's one-time appropriations, and then there's other costs at the state level.
Yes, Senator Hashim.
What is categorical aid?
Yes, so categorical aid are those dollars that are being, the term is often used off the top of the education fund, and those are dollars that are for a specific purpose that are going to a school district. So that's special education, state-placed students, got a whole list of them here. And we
Can you call it a block grant? Is it the same thing as a block grant?
Essentially. So that's what, so going into the ed fund outlook, to get to your question specifically, Senator, we see that all of the categorical aid here in lines 11 through 19. So I know that's small. See if I can make it bigger. We've got special ed, state-placed students, transportation, tech ed, small school.
So some of these categorical aid areas are, I'm getting a sense they come from policy decisions that are made here saying, all right, here's money for X, Y, and Z. And then the general expenditures, I think it was called, those are coming from the local school boards, which go to teacher salaries and just all that stuff, all the other stuff.
Yeah, so somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 80% of education spending I've heard is related to personnel costs. And of course, these are costs that the school district is building into its budget as this is what we have to spend, or this is what we're choosing to spend. And there's no value judgment when calculating the ed spending. Essentially, it's just taking the school district's budget, taking out these different pieces, and then everything that's left over is education spending. All right. So we already looked at this. This is a snapshot of the Ed Fund outlook, which is kind of like similar to an operating statement, which spells out all of the numbers in the Ed Fund. This is what I'm presenting to Ways and Means every week when talking about the modeling. And it is posted on your website. We can walk through it in more detail. That would be helpful. But this is just a snapshot of this is where all the appropriations are listed out in the outlook. So, whirlwind tour of expenditures coming out of the Ed Fund. Now going into Ed funding, unless there's questions. Okay.
Would you say that the Ed Fund has gone through in the past, I'm not sure if you're able to answer this or not, but in the past 10 years, there's been an effort to remove things from the Ed Fund that might not belong there? I remember some of these conversations and a little bit of this work.
So with respect to the money that's coming out of the Ed Fund, I would really need to defer to policymakers in terms of why things have or have not fit into the Ed Fund. So education funding, we've already looked at this. We can see those two buckets. We can see the sort of the breakdown of the way of thinking about sources that flow into the education fund. So again, with the whole two buckets way of thinking about things, here we can see the two buckets. One is property tax. The other is all of the other non-property tax revenue sources. So as we spoke about earlier, we've got X number of dollars that need to be paid out of the education fund or put into a reserve or any policy decision. And then we have a number of non-property tax revenue sources. So that includes sales and use tax. It includes a portion of meals and rooms, a portion of purchase and use, lottery transfer, etc. So we've got all of our expenditures. We subtract out all of those non-property tax revenue sources. And the remainder, so usually about 2/3 of the dollars that the funds that need to be made up are made up through property tax rates. So there's that flexible lever of the property taxes.
Yes, sir, Joe.
Don't wanna go down a rabbit hole.
No,
but,
go.
I believe recently, Joint Fiscal did a study on income tax versus property tax based Ed funding. Is that correct?
So there was a study committee 2 summers ago made up of 6 legislators who looked into an income tax instead of a property tax. It was staffed by JFO Ledge Council, but it came from a group of legislators.
All right, and I believe in the end there were no definitive answers or any definitive suggestions, but I'm wondering if JFO did a deep dive into what the two systems would look like, how different they would be or similar. Did that work get done?
Yeah, so the committee was really looking at exactly that question. And our role is really to help policymakers answer questions. So one of the questions is, well, if there were to be an income tax, what would the structure of it be? So that was for the committee to discuss. And there's a report that spells out the recommendations, the big picture things that they looked at, and a lot of supporting documents. I'd be happy to share that with you if you're interested in looking through it in more detail.
I definitely, were you able to paint a financial picture in the end of what it would look like under an income tax system, or?
There were some there were certainly examples, and there was modeling that we did, and the committee did not reach, I don't want to use the word consensus, but didn't necessarily get far enough along in the deliberations for there to be, this is exactly what it would look like, and this is what the rates would look like. For instance, the committee didn't say there are gonna be X number of brackets, and this is how much, these are the brackets that we want, and these are the corresponding rates associated with those brackets. So there was some modeling that was like, here are a couple of different potential ideas based on the committee's requests. But they were not recommendations.
Right.
Thank you.
So it sounds to me like generally like the work wasn't like fully fleshed out to the extent where it would need to be to make any changes.
Yeah, I would defer to the legislators who served on that committee.
Ms. Richter, would you be the best person to just sort of take us through that report?
I could certainly take you through the
I
report.
think that would be great, right?
It was staff,
Even if it's not,
I'm the remaining staffer still around that also staff the committee.
young man, sir, sir. Senator Lyons.
Okay, that's good.
And Morgan,
Yes,
Morgan, would you have Ms. Richter in next week with that report?
absolutely.
Alright, sure.
Great.
Going back?
Going back.
All right. So going back, we're talking about education funding sources and revenues. So this is where they are on the Ed Fund outlook, the revenues. We've already spoken about this, the non-property tax revenue sources and the property tax revenue sources. And so now we're gonna do a little bit of a deeper dive into property taxes. For I think the remainder of the slides that I put together, how they work in general. So we've talked about how they're set to keep the education fund balanced. We've talked about that there's 2 property tax bases subject to the statewide education tax. It's important to note it is statewide, and that the rates differ by base, as Senator asked about. So that's the non-homestead property and the homestead property. Here I pulled out part of the definition of homestead, and it's that principal dwelling where someone lives surrounding acreage. Everything else is not homestead. So we'll start on non-homestead because it's a little bit simpler. This is in subject if the property is non-homestead and subject to property tax. There are some properties that are exempt from property tax. Non-homestead property is subject to a uniform non-homestead property tax rate across towns at the equalized level. And when I say equalized, that's important to note. That's talking about before the application of the CLA. Thinking back into what the CLA is essentially it's a tool because there's a statewide education fund and not all towns are appraising their properties at the same time or by the same person. There needs to be some tool to make sure that all properties are being taxed at a fair market value. So essentially what the CLA aims to do is it serves almost like a statistical reappraisal. Basically, it's calculated annually by the tax department and it looks at, okay, what are the properties appraised at in this town and what are properties actually being sold at in this town, and calculates a ratio. And so that ratio is then used to adjust the tax rate. It could also be used to adjust the property value. It would mathematically be the same. That ratio is used to adjust the property tax rate to make sure that all of the property taxpayers across the state are paying their fair share regardless of where their town is in the appraisal process. So a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I think it's important to context to have when thinking about the uniform non-homestead tax rate. So if everyone was appraised at fair market value, there would be no CLA and everyone would be seeing the same non-homestead property tax rate on there. Getting back to your question, Senator, this non-homestead property tax rate is set in statute and it's annually not withstood by the legislature. It's set in session law. Usually it's referred to as part of the yield bill. And this is part of that calculation process of how much do we need to raise and how much does the General Assembly see for an average bill increase in non-homestead and an average bill increase in homestead. And then I and others work to calculate those yields and rates using a yield model, which has all of this information in it. It's got revenue streams and grand list values and spending decisions. And it's a lot of work and a lot of data going into the calculation of a couple of numbers. So I'll pause there because that's all I was planning on saying about non-homestead property taxes.
Yeah, please.
So there was some chatter about what comes first, the budgets or the property tax rate. And I'm wondering if you can just give a quick overview of that process.
Yes, so careful, I'm gonna scroll up in slides, so I don't want anyone to get motion sick. We ended up skipping over this to get into some of your questions, but this is a timeline that might be helpful. So these two kind of go hand in hand. So school boards and school districts, and I will defer to folks on the ground in terms of when that process begins. That's very outside of my bailiwick, but starting in the fall, I think they're building and preparing those school budgets, and then they will be warned. And then, so those school districts and school boards are building their budgets, and then statutorily on or before December 1st, the tax commissioner in consensus with Joint Fiscal Office and the Agency of Education needs to publish what's called the December 1st letter. And that is really a starting point for deliberations. It's written into statute. This is how we have to calculate it. No policy decisions are made in that modeling. And it's based on the best available data, which is not great because we don't have school budgets yet. And there's a number of other factors that will continue to be updated as the process rolls forward. So that's the starting point. And then March, town meeting day, school boards or school districts present their budgets, voters vote on those budgets. And then we continue to get better data and update it. And then the legislature, General Assembly then passes the yield bill to set the yields and the rates. Does that answer your question?
It does. It's really great.
May I editorialize just a little bit?
Of course.
Thank you. Which is just that it's really, really difficult for school boards and districts to try to make these decisions based on incomplete information. And also information that changes. We just had a whole bunch of budget scenarios and then the CLA came out and we had to completely change almost everything. So I just it's a shout out to the work that's done by districts and boards because it's very difficult without having all the information up front.
Are you willing to kind of put a little detail behind that? So for example, the December 1 letter forecasted something like a 20% or 18%.
18.5.
18.5%, okay. So how does that affect you at the school board level when you're trying to develop a budget? Did you see that as a benefit or a drawback that the rates would go up? Does that mean you get more cash in the end, or does that mean that you're going into austerity?
So it complicates the story for sure, because suddenly there's this letter saying that tax rates are going to go up, what was it, 18.5%, whereas we're trying to build a budget to educate our students and pay our staff, et cetera. And then, you build out these scenarios But in this case, CLA, which I think just came out last week, then further complicated the situation because we had made assumptions based on different numbers. You do have to use some assumptions when you're doing the work, right?
And the people that the voters have to approve the budget.
Right.
You don't wanna have it voted down 4 times because people got angry when they saw 18.5%.
And actually, even when you vote in March, there are still some decisions that come out later.
So then the 18.5% doesn't increase, it doesn't necessarily reflect some of the special projects that you might have at the school board level, say for, say, a new gymnasium, whatever.
Okay, and the 18, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's also based on a bunch of assumptions.
Right, I get the assumption bit, yes, I get that bit. What I'm saying, what I'm asking is, taking the December 1, 18.5%, and you as a school board member projecting, building your own budget, do you now then theoretically have to add on top of the 18.5% if you're going to do the special project specific to your
Yes.
district? Okay.
I think it's safe to say yes to that question.
Okay.
And I think that a little bit of clarification may be helpful. And I can certainly not speak at all to school districts, school boards, the decisions that they are making. Getting to the school construction question and the gymnasium, for instance. So because it's a statewide education fund, the cost of that gymnasium is going to fit within the school district budget, which is then going to flow into the statewide education fund. So there's not a separate pot of money that the school district needs to raise for a gymnasium or other construction projects. That's gonna be baked into that education spending number.
Statewide, gets absorbed by everyone.
Yes. And it gets absorbed by everybody, and that's a perfect segue back into homestead property tax rates, because local spending decisions, local, per weighted pupil, impact the school district's homestead property tax rate. So while it impacts everyone, it most directly impacts the homestead property taxpayers in the school district. And we'll talk about how the mechanics of that work here. So
Director Maska,
yes,
how often has the legislature said to school districts, you cannot have more than 5% growth? 10%, when you're looking at I remember, I think during the Shumlin administration, there was a back and forth, some kind, I may be misremembering it.
so I'm not aware of that happening. I'm not saying that it hasn't happened.
Sure.
I'm not familiar with a case where that happened, because the structure really is that there's the local school district budgets that are being approved by local voters, and then they need to be funded with state revenues.
Ms. Siglowski, does that sound familiar to you at all? And it might have been just a sort of a vague, hey, go back and take a look, dig a little harder, that kind of thing.
It's ringing a little bit of a bell, but I don't think it was exactly as you described.
Right,
So
right.
we could look into the
Okay,
history
yeah,
of that.
I can jump in also. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So homestead property tax, we've talked about how it's dependent on its locally approved education spending per pupil. We've talked about what that education spending number is, right? It's the budget minus the offsetting revenue. The remainder is the education spending. I have words and a formula on this slide because my brain works in equations, and I know that other people's brains work better with words. So both are saying essentially the same thing.
Right.
So I'm gonna walk through the equation because that's, I think, a helpful place to start. So essentially what we're looking at here is, can you see my cursor? Yeah, is the way that a school district's homestead property tax rate is calculated. Remember, this is before the application of the CLA. And so we've got a number of factors here that we're gonna just kind of walk through one by one. So what's highlighted in green is what varies by school district. And then in the denominator here, we see the property yield. And so this is set annually at the statewide level. So how does this work? So we see that by school district, we're calculating the education spending. Oh, this will be changing this coming year into long-term weighted ADM. We did not update that. But, so essentially what we have is we've got the education spending number being divided by, and I apologize, this should say long-term weighted average daily membership. Essentially, the number of kids on average who are sitting in the school plus all of the pupil weights that school district receives based on its student makeup. So it's got, on average, how many butts are in chairs, plus a factor called a pupil weight that accounts for students who may be more or less costly to educate. So that those categories include English language learners, kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, kids at different grades, etc. So that's what we're seeing. That's all this green factor is, and it varies by school district.
You throw the term long-term weighted daily
Average daily membership.
average daily.
Yes, and I will send an updated slide deck to Morgan, so you have that. That's what's coming in with the new Act 127. So that's that local adjustment factor. And it's all divided by the statewide property yield, which is set annually by the legislature. So you can see how a school district's spending decisions and a school district's weighted pupils impact its property tax rate. This isn't saying this is how many dollars you get. Instead, it's saying this is how we're going to calculate your property tax rate based on spending and weighted pupils. And then it's all divided by the statewide property yield, which is a number I calculate. I know it feels like a black box, but it's coming out of this model that's taking into account everything that's happening in the fund and all the grant list values.
You just touched on it, but the property yield, can you say that again?
Sure.
Didn't really resonate.
Sure. So the statewide property yield, one way of thinking about it is if every school, so one way of thinking about it is the amount of education spending per weighted pupil that would correspond with a dollar tax rate. So in other words, let's just pick some round numbers. Let's say that the statewide property yield is 10,000, right? So if a school district had per pupil education spending of 10,000, its tax rate would be $1. If it had per pupil spending of 11,000, it's greater than the property yield. So its tax rate would proportionately be adjusted upward to account for the amount it's spending greater than the statewide property yield. Is that helpful?
Good.
So that's the crux of it right here. Homestead property tax rates are adjusted by the local spending per pupil. And then also we'll recall the property yield is statewide. And so that's calculated to make sure there's sufficient revenues in the education fund. So because property tax rates are a function of spending per pupil decisions, and not a function of property value in a school district, gets back to the earlier point that we were talking about a gymnasium and how that fits in. Yes, it's going to increase the spending per pupil of the school district, and we need to adjust the property yield to make sure enough money is being raised to fully fund that gymnasium.
Yes, please.
Something is from a local perspective that, as the local select board and the town manager and board of aldermen are developing their budget in one room. School board is over here developing theirs. Never the twain shall meet in a lot of cases, so, but they're interrelated. So my experience as a select board member was that, you know, we're always trying to keep the tax rate down because, you know, we don't want the taxpayers to have to get a big increase. But there was always the question mark with what's the school budget? So, because in my community, 81% of our property taxes go to pay for education. And every town is different.
So if I could ask kind of,
All right, just put me on the hot seat
First
today,
one.
all right,
so Burlington bonded for a school.
correct.
Is that on top of this conversation? Or is that just an additional?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And that school bond fits into the education fund. So that's part of when we're calculating Burlington's homestead property tax rate. That school bond, and the annual payments for the bond fit into the budget and then flow through to the education spending number, which then flows through to the calculation of Burlington's homestead property tax rate.
Okay, so to put it slightly different, did the rest of the state essentially contribute to the bond?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. As a matter of practice, that's the way we live.
That's hence the 18.5% right there. Everybody's talking about that. I remember one year it was going up 11, Beth Pierce was treasurer. It's going to go up to 11%. And everybody tried to adjust for that announcement. And then it actually went down to 90% because they found some funding they didn't have. And this year we've got the education tax over surplus that's got to go back to the taxpayers for education. So that 18% that has been announced includes that surplus going back in.
So the 18.5%, and it's an average bill change. So that's the overall average estimated increase in liability. It includes everything in the ed fund. So part of this, part of the statutory modeling requirements for the December 1st letter that we need to, this year we needed to assume there was a tax rate offset reserve. The General Assembly set aside $13 million last year. We had to assume all $13 million were going to uniformly lowering tax bills. Same, all of the funds, the surplus you're referring to, the funds on the bottom line have also been applied to uniformly lowering tax rates.
Following on Senator, are you good?
Yep.
Weeks' question, regarding Senator Hewlett's Jim or the bonding. That
Jim's next, the
Jim's
bond,
next.
school is last.
prior to Act 60, we weren't all chipping in.
Yeah, and so exactly.
Sure,
So
right.
that's something that is sometimes challenging in the discourse of
Sure.
thinking through this because of the way that education funding has changed in the state over the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
So before there was a different education funding system where towns were relying on their own local grand list, in part, and the state would make up if they couldn't raise sufficient funds on the grand list. And then there was the Brigham decision that said that that was unconstitutional. There needs to be, and
Equitable funding.
I would defer to Ledge Council to talk about the Brigham decision, but essentially it led to this system where all school districts, regardless of their property wealth, have equitable funding opportunities.
Senator Weeks and Senator Schumer.
Yeah, just curious, so what's the lever that inhibits all of us from just bonding and having the cost dilute across the state?
So, again, a policy question. The the conversation has included, the fact that property tax rates, homestead rates in districts that are spending more are going to see a greater increase than homestead property tax rates in districts that are spending less per pupil. Historically, there was the excess spending threshold, which essentially was, school districts spending up to X amount, or above X amount are gonna see a greater, impact for those additional funds. That was suspended during COVID and then further suspended in Act 127.
Right.
But the direct link between spending decisions and how that's felt is in the homestead property tax rate.
Senator Schumer, Senator Williams.
Thank you. Just going back to something that was brought up earlier regarding the surplus and having that go back to taxpayers. Does that, when that does go back to taxpayers, is it to reduce the homestead or the non-homestead tax rate, or is it both?
Great question, and I know I keep saying this, but that's a policy decision.
Okay.
So,
Do you know what the current policy is?
so it depends every year. So last year, I was asked to calculate the yields and the non-homestead rate so that the uniform bill change would be, so that the bill change on average would be uniform for both homestead, non-homestead, and income sensitized taxpayers. And so it's up to the General Assembly. You could say, we want to increase the average bill of this class X% while decreasing the average bill of this class by X%, as long as there were enough revenue raised to fully fund the ed fund.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess just generally a comment where we can. I imagine this is in the finance committee, right? I mean, where we can, I would like to see it focus on the homestead tax rate for the folks who are currently living in our state, rather than second homeowners. But that is a policy decision for. Well, it's not just second homeowners; it's also apartment buildings.
Apartment buildings, businesses, it's every property that needs to pay property tax that's not a homestead.
Yeah, that's Senator Williams and then Senator Buick.
So Act 60 was the equity in education that was made. So when the school district has to cut back on the price per pupil that they're spending because of their tax implications, that kind of takes away from that equity in education. We're back to a rich town that can afford more. They can have a higher, that has more of a grand list, can have more to weight their pupil, their per pupil spending than a town that doesn't. So
Would you say that's accurate?
Do you mind rephrasing that last
I'm
part?
not questioning him, I just wanted,
if, I'm just saying that when Act 60 came out, there were a lot of towns that complained because this school district had a really good school program. They had all the perks, but once the state came in and got involved, they said, well, you can't do that anymore because we're going to take that and give it to this school district that doesn't have as much. That's a kind of a generalization.
I mean, are wealthier districts still able to benefit from their wealth where poor districts cannot?
So I would say that school districts can include in their school district budget what they see as what needs to be or should be included in their budget. So the state, with Act 60, didn't say this school district can no longer provide, this class or this service so that the money is taken and given over here. Instead it said, we're having a statewide ed funding system where your tax rate is going to be adjusted. And so if the school district spends this much per pupil, then it will pay a higher rate than districts that spend less per pupil.
Hence my 81% of my municipality, 60 and up. So,
Right, you're around town.
and it's constitutional requirement that we provide an education for our children. Doesn't say you gotta pay property taxes.
My question was actually just for Senator Hashim, and we can speak offline, but I was just wondering if you would be willing to explain what you talked about earlier, what you think. I
Oh,
think
with
you said-
the, with,
Non-property, no, not homestead.
oh, with the surplus going back.
No, it was more about the burden of the funding being placed more heavily on the homestead tax folks. Did I hear that?
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, I think we're talking about the same thing. No, it was just a thought going back to the surplus that was mentioned earlier by Senator Williams, going back to taxpayers and whether or not that is used to lower homestead tax rates or non-homestead tax rates. And, my initial thought is, the first thing that pops into my mind when I think non-homestead, I think of second homeowners. But it also, as was mentioned, encompasses apartments, and so, and landlords, property owners are going to offset the costs of property tax increases onto their tenants. And so I'm just trying to think of, what is the best way to, evenly or equitably try to relieve or mitigate some of the tax burden for folks who are living in our state. But like I mentioned, apartment buildings fall under the non-homestead category.
Thank you for clarifying.
Do you want to question it?
I appreciate that.
Sure.
Now, it's affected in the rent too, because
No.
the
yeah, I
renter is
appreciate
paying
I wasn't sure where.
the additional, rent payment.
Yeah, and
So
I don't
everybody's
want to
paying.
inadvertently then increase the tax rates for, places that have more apartment buildings, compared to plenty of single family homes. So, yeah, it's a kind of a balance, or trying to find.
Well,
a
we have
balance.
we gave it this an hour, so Howard, can you can we do some closure kinds of things?
Yeah,
in
so-
minutes? But I know Senator Weeks has a
Quick
question
question.
for Senator Dewitt.
Turn on the spot.
This is good, thank you.
Yeah,
It's very good, it's a great conversation.
We might.
I'm happy to come back. I've gone through what I was hoping to go through in terms of the level setting. I think one just helpful thing to add to your conversation or your thought process is you're looking to decrease the property tax burden. There's a few different levers that exist within the education fund. One is to reduce expenditures. Where, how they're reduced is policy. Thank you. You see where I'm going?
Starting here.
Senator Hashim.
Real quick, reducing expenditures, earlier it was mentioned that 70 to 80% are personnel costs, right? So
Mhm.
is, which.
Of education spending. Sorry.
Okay, so regarding reducing expenditures, do you have specific thoughts on which expenditures, or is that more so a policy decision?
Firmly in the policy camp. In Act 127, we did have to publish a report. Part of it included doing research into methods for cost containment, like what the literature says. So that is a resource with respect to cost containment, and there's
What was
no,
that report?
I can share it with
Oh,
you.
are you talking about that at 3:30, any of that?
I am not.
Okay, you're zooming in though. when
I'm
Beth is-
zooming in for a phone a friend, if need be. Yes, and or happy to talk about anything.
Great.
I think we're talking about Act 127,
Right.
so just to fully close the loop, so reducing expenditures, policy decision. And then the other option is changing the revenue into the, so if you wanna reduce the property taxes, either expenditures need to go down or
Change the reference.
revenues need to go up, or maybe the data will come in and we'll see a different picture. But changing revenue sources, that would be, changing revenue sources that are flowing into the education fund and or changing tax expenditures associated with those revenue sources and or adjusting property taxes and who's seeing which average bill
I
change.
suggest that we have, Ms. Richter back in to dig into this a little bit more, because it just seems like we're scratching the surface of what kinds of levers we have to kind of offset what's happening right now, and that's like another big conversation.
Sure.
So, yeah, absolutely. So next week, I think just on that specific sort of the levers, what are the possibilities that the legislature could do to address this?
Yes.
I mean, just, we'll carve out that for that specific.
So my quick question.
Yeah, please.
So back to a comment that Senator Sheen made a moment ago, that landlords typically pass on property taxes to tenants. Why are apartment buildings not considered non-homestead? Why are they in the category of non-homestead?
Policy.
Okay, I get that, but any anecdotal history or
I don't know.
just
It's a good question. I'm not sure.
Senator,
Yeah.
Senator,
Get the mirror out, right?
This has been terrific.
Great.
Really helpful. Morgan is going to have you back next week to talk about specifically around levers that we can pull. And then we also have, we had one other thing, Morgan, that you were gonna put on the calendar,
Education and tax.
education income tax. You there?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Let's take 10 minutes and then we'll shift gears and we'll come back to waiting.
I love that policy, it's a policy that said, this St. James is.
I know, it's funny you said, I was thinking the
It's
same
always
thing.
policy,
Right.
you know,